Good evening and welcome to the 10th episode of Leadership Conversations in the Development Sector. The social impact sector is full of passionate leaders with innovative outlooks on the world's greatest problems. Our leadership conversations focus on the unique insights offered by these leaders as they share their experiences and move the development sector forward. Our host, Go Barefoot, is an interactive web portal dedicated to the social sector. It brings together individuals, NGOs, NPOs, and the CSR arms of organizations with the mandate of creating a one-stop information website for both networking and knowledge sharing. We are supported by Kakkar, NGO, which has been preparing young women for leadership roles to create equality in opportunities and bridge the gender gap. Also, we are supported by Third Sector Partners, India's only executive search firm exclusively for the development sector. Our guest today is one of the leading lights in the development sector. I'd like to extend a warm welcome to Ingrid Srinath, Director, Center for Social Impact and Philanthropy, Ashoka University. Ingrid Srinath has been a passionate advocate for human rights, social justice, and civil society for over 2 decades. She is presently the founder director of the Center for Social Impact and Philanthropy at Ashoka University in India. CSIP is South Asia's first academic center focused on philanthropy and social impact. Following her PGDM from the Indian Institute of Management, Calcutta in 1986, Ingrid worked on some of India's greatest brands, Lintas and Grey Worldwide, before transitioning to the non-profit sector in 1998 with CRY, where she was CEO. Served as Secretary General at CIVICUS, the World Alliance for Citizen Participation, as Executive Director of CHILDLINE India Foundation, and as CEO of HIVOS India. Ms. Srinath is a member of Securities Exchange Board of India's Technical Committee on the Social Stock Exchange and of the NITI Aayog Sub-Committee on the Voluntary Sector. She has served on the advisory boards of the United Nations Development Programme, the United Nations Development Cooperation Forum, and the World Economic Forum. In 2021, Ingrid received the Distinguished Alumnus Award from her alma mater, IIM Calcutta, in recognition of her contributions to civil society and philanthropy. In conversation with Ms. Srinath is Shital Kakkar Mehra, leadership expert and executive presence coach for CEOs. Shital has trained over 75,000 professionals across Asia and has personally coached over 1,000 CXOs in the past 2 decades. She has conducted workshops for diverse organizations across Asia and has been invited as a speaker by leading B schools and professional associations. Shital is a best-selling author, and her latest book, Executive Presence, The Poised Formula for Leadership, is India's first research-based formula on this leadership skill. Shital is an active philanthropist and social entrepreneur. Thank you, Ingrid and Shital, for joining us today. Over to you, Shital.
Thank you. Welcome, Ingrid. It's a pleasure and an honor to have you here, and our listeners are very excited to hear your views on leadership. I'm going to, thank you. I'm going to start with my first question, that globally the divide between the social and corporate sector is breaking. What are some of the processes that the development sector can take from the corporate sector, and what the corporate sector can learn from the development sector?
So I think there are 3 or 4 things that we in the development sector can pick up from the corporate sector. And the first one, I think, is just the scale of our ambition. In the corporate sector these days, people founding companies are thinking of global, game-changing, disruptive initiatives. Whereas too often in our sector, we're looking at incremental things. Or we're looking at, can we just start in a village or a community? So I wish we could emulate the scale of their ambition in our sector. The other one, I think, is, and this may be the most important one, I think we could, if we could, like them, set aside our many differences and learn to come together, at least to lobby for our own sector. That would be a fantastic thing that we could import from them. I mean, I'm always struck by how every industry in the corporate sector has an association that is able to sort of push for defend its interests. Whereas on our side of the fence, we struggle to get together even a few organizations behind that cause. I think the other one really is just in terms of a systems orientation. The idea of building institutions and brands rather than being personality driven or individual connections and relationships driven. There are equally, though, some things that we absolutely must not learn from the corporate sector. And that is, the idea of what I call excessive pragmatism, where you put profits before people, before the planet, where ends are allowed to justify the means, where you see people, human beings, as these sort of soulless financial calculators who are constantly trying to optimize their net worth, where you lose sight of values like justice or equity or dignity. I think on the other side, and so those are the things maybe that the corporate sector could learn from the development sector. But in a more pragmatic way, I think the one thing that the corporate sector is struggling with right now is employees today are not happy to simply work for a paycheck. I mean, obviously, this depends on which socioeconomic category you're talking with. For too many of our fellow citizens, the paycheck is a means of survival, and so they don't have the luxury of thinking about, purpose and mission and other such things. But young employees, particularly in some of the more creative sectors, are really looking to align their personal values with their jobs, with the companies that they work with their consumption habits, their investment habits. And so companies, whether they're looking at them as employees, customers, investors, or just the public at large, could really do well to learn from the nonprofit sector how to do that mission-driven motivation rather than relying on, just money to try and keep people. We know, as well as I do, it's not working. People, if money is your main reason for working for a company, then the next company that offers you a little bit more, you're going to move to them because that's the currency that you're trading in. So I think that's probably the key thing that the corporate sector could learn from the nonprofit sector.
Super, very well articulated, and I couldn't agree with you more. In fact, they say that in 2021 will go down in history as corporate sector's the great resignation, because people are just leaving left, right, and center to pursue all their dreams, goals that they always had. Yeah, sure. So we're going to talk about the pandemic, and we have seen during the pandemic how governments had to work very closely across the world, had to work very closely with both the corporate and the development sector, whether it was the development of the vaccine or the vaccination drive at the grassroots level, building awareness for wearing masks or hygiene, social distancing. So all of that. So it was almost like a tripod. So what can the government, according to you, learn from the development of the social sector?
So I think again, several things, but the main ones really are, first of all, just the importance of and the art and science of listening. I think a lot of the errors that we've made during the pandemic or even outside of the pandemic has really been because of the lack of adequate consultation with the people who are going to be affected by those policies. So I think the art and science of listening, then being able to synthesize all that input and build consensus, I think would be one thing that the nonprofit sector, we do it in our sleep. We just assume that it's the way we do policy in our sector. So I think the government could really learn from that. I think values of service. So, rather than seeing themselves as either sort of people distributing largesse, some sort of benefactors. I'm constantly seeing ads and communication from the government, which is like, we are doing you this favor by producing this scheme for you, or by giving you access to vaccines, or by doing whatever else. I think to really flip that on its head and see them as being privileged enough to be able to serve citizens, the humility of that would be a second thing that they could learn from the nonprofit sector. I think certainly longer term thinking. In the nonprofit sector, we're used to the idea that change is going to take 5, 7, 10 years. I think for governments who have to stand for election every 5 years, they're trapped in this cycle where literally by the time you get yourself up to speed, form all your policies and get them off the ground, you're into another election. And so we then get trapped in short-term thinking because governments have to deliver within those 1 or 2 years that they have before they're, in campaign mode again. So I think long-term thinking would be the other one. I mean, I wish really that we would see that the government could see that you can't solve problems through apps and you can't solve problems through acronyms, that you have to there is a process. You have to earn people's trust and that you have to partner in a genuine way, not extort partnership from people.
Very beautifully put. So, you worked extensively during the pandemic to connect the donors with the NGOs. So please share your experience for our listeners on how technology has impacted fundraising in the sector.
So CSIP did 2 studies of how COVID was impacting nonprofits, one in 2020 and one in 2021. And one of the big sort of macro findings that we had was that there were 3 traits that distinguished those nonprofits that not only survived but thrived versus the ones that were, paralyzed by the pandemic. One of those was the roots that the nonprofit has in its community. So, the deeper those roots were, the better nonprofits were to sense what the needs were. They were getting those signals quickly, they were getting them accurately, they were then able to respond in a really agile manner. The second trait was the devolution of authority within the organization. So if the staff at the front line felt that they had the freedom to actually respond and didn't have to go up the stovepipe and, get 3 layers of decision making before they responded, that was a second trait. And the third one was then to take what was happening at the grassroots and turn it into compelling communication for their donors and for the media. And technology was integral at each of these stages. So one of my favorite examples is an organization called Jan Sahas, which many of you might know, that works with migrant workers and victims of sexual and domestic violence across the country. Jan Sahas, the technology at the first level of the listening phase was with their helpline. As soon as COVID started, they saw the jump in traffic on the helpline. And the helpline then became that source of first-hand data of what was happening, where it was happening, and what was needed. The second one was in terms of their ability then to literally feed that information up the system and come back with decisions in less than 24 hours, where again, technology played that role because they were able to connect frontline to head office in a really rapid response kind of mode. And the third piece was how they were then able to take that data that they were getting from the front lines and turn it into fantastic communication. So they produced a great report about what was happening, which then, resulted not only in them becoming quite popular with donors, but also it became the stories that the media then took and made migrant workers the issue of the first phase of the pandemic.
Yeah, that's how it got highlighted. So that was the first one heard about it, how going forward, how do you feel that donor profile will change?
So it's always hard to predict the future, but what we're seeing right now by way of trends is there's a whole bunch of new philanthropists. So there were, people, particularly out of the tech sector, but also in other sectors who I'm sure they would have become philanthropists eventually, but COVID has sort of accelerated that transition. And they've been almost bitten by that philanthropic bug. You can see it, the excitement with which they talk about the work that they've been doing. And so there's a whole new bunch who are bringing completely fresh ways of thinking into the sector. The second one, I think, is we're seeing new forms of giving. So obviously, because of the lockdown, the only way to give was online. And so we're seeing this huge surge in online giving. And maybe that is a trend that that I hope will stick, because it is certainly one of the easiest and most cost-effective ways to raise money. But also this trend of mutual aid, you know, of you might say of getting rid of the intermediary altogether, of citizens just helping each other, rather than waiting for either the government or for an NGO to step in. We're seeing, certainly, I think it's not been talked about as much, but a huge increase in giving from overseas Indians, especially in the second phase. I mean, the diaspora across the world, but in the US in particular, not only gave much more than they've ever given in the past, but the profile of that donor widened, you know, where earlier it might have been a few wealthy Silicon Valley people or a few people in, you know, physicians and people in professions. This time it was everybody, students, families, communities across the board. And finally, the other change on the diaspora side of it was they moved from just giving money to also doing advocacy. So whether it was, you know, I would say an employees at a company like Salesforce. Now, Salesforce has not, as far as I know, been a major donor to India in the past, but they employ a large number of Indians. And those Indians were then successful in really galvanizing Salesforce into responding. Or when they went to the Biden administration and got, you know, the export controls on those vaccine ingredients lifted. There are a lot more people of Indian origin in this US administration than they ever have been in the past. And so there's greater access and perhaps greater responsiveness to advocacy from the diaspora community. Two more things really. One is, I think we're looking at new intermediaries. So where in the past it's been NGOs who've been the primary intermediaries, today your intermediary could be Amazon, it could be Ola, it could be, you know, a Facebook. So, you know, you suddenly saw, for example, Facebook events becoming a major fundraising tool because all on the ground events became impossible. Or you looked at an Ola becoming a mechanism to get oxygen concentrators. Or you look, you know, you could, let's say a community could post requirements on Amazon and then an individual donor could go and pay for those requirements via Amazon. So NGOs in particular need to think really hard about, are they now being almost marginalized in this process of companies and other intermediaries taking over? But the one big trend, the biggest trend I think that we need to be aware of is the shift in agency. It doesn't matter which donor you're talking about, whether it's diaspora or a young person or somebody doing mutual aid or somebody writing a large check. All donors need a much greater say in the design of the programs that they're going to fund. They really want to be co-creators of programs and not just check writers. And that's another thing I think a lot of NGOs are struggling with because they were so used to the idea of these wonderful benefactors who would just write a check and then forget about it and wait for a report to come in.
Right. So accountability, ownership, many things. And yeah, interestingly, you also mentioned social media, which was going to be my next question. That is social media gaining prominence. And, you know, we've seen during the second wave as well, that people were posting their requirements on Twitter, on Facebook, on WhatsApp. So what is your view on personal branding on social media? Any practices that you follow or your organization in terms of getting the message across, or, you know, if you could share something about that.
I don't know whether either I or my organization are particularly expert at anything to do with social media, but just a few lessons maybe that I've learned. First of all, let me put it into perspective. I think for those of us who are online, we think there's a lot of activity happening on social media. I've just seen some research data which suggests that this is a very small bubble, that for the country at large, what's happening on Twitter really doesn't matter at all. It's kind of a storm in a teacup. So you need to put it into perspective. But having said that, I think for me personally, one of the great benefits of social media is that it allows you to position yourself as in your domain. So, you know, you can really target, you can create a really well-targeted position. You know whom you want to reach out to, you know what it is you want to be known for. And if you can become that trusted source of expertise or knowledge or connections on a particular subject, then, for example, the media will come to you rather than you having to go to the media. So we've had, for example, during this FCRA crisis and then during COVID and other issues, journalists now come to you rather than you having to push a story out to the media, which is fantastic. And the second is, of course, to reach out to other people in your domain. So I think it's become, social media makes it a lot easier to be known outside of your immediate geography. I mean, even if you're a tiny organization in, let's say, Manipur or something, you can still be a globally known entity on social media. And so it vastly expands the footprint that you can have in your domain, whatever that may be. In terms of
that's true.
What you put out there, I think the only learning I have is to just be human. You know, I mean, if you sound like a caricature, you sound like a press release, then that's not particularly productive. I think people want authenticity, and so if you can be a complete human being, not just be putting out promotional messages, but really giving people some sense of who you are as a person, that's really beneficial.
Couldn't agree with you more. And yes, authenticity is important in person, and of course has to be synchronized with your online presence as well. Superb. So we are going to change tracks and move to leadership and in the development sector. Now, you have been a very prominent leader for over 2 decades. And in your experience, how has leadership evolved? Because the social sector has evolved, grown, changed over the last couple of decades. So how has leadership evolved to rise up to this challenge?
So I think 20 years ago, the sector was still dominated by some extremely passionate visionaries who had amazing ideas for how change would happen. They were not always backed up by operational excellence. And so in many cases, that fantastic vision was constrained by way of scale or by way of sustainability, because it did not have the operational processes and skills and systems that would allow it to become scalable and sustainable. I think that's probably the single biggest change, that you're seeing a degree of professionalization and corporatization that then allows those fantastic visions to turn into a scalable, sustainable reality. And we're going through, particularly right now, because a lot of well-known Indian NGOs were founded in the 70s. And so you're going through a major leadership transition between founders to executive leaders, either a handover of leadership or a supplementing of leadership with executive leaders. And I think what they're bringing with them is this focus on building institutions and brands rather than being dependent on personal charisma or credibility or networks and relationships. I think that's the main change. I actually worry that we may be going too far in the opposite direction, and we need to find a healthy balance of the two. But that's probably something that we need to talk about in greater length.
True. Now, in your career in this sector, you have led several organizations, you have developed very high potential leaders. So can you share with us some ways that you have developed leadership and proactively developed performers in the sector?
So if I have to put a label on my so-called leadership style, I would call it benign neglect. I think it's sort of my lack of intervention that might be my most positive contribution to building leaders. Now, I think the way I've approached it is to invest time in building consensus around a vision, but then give people the space, the headroom, and the resources and the backing to make their own mistakes, to lead in their own particular way, and to realize that vision in their sort of innovate in whichever way they see. So really, create that the framework, and then let people go to sort of do what they can. I think the other thing perhaps is to constantly raise the bar. I think quite often, particularly in our sector, people may not fully appreciate their own strengths. It's unlike the corporate sector where people are constantly promoting themselves and constantly seeking growth and that sort of thing. In our sector, quite often that's not the case, especially with women. And so, to really help people see what that next step might look like and to give them the encouragement and the opportunities to go beyond what they might see as their constraints, I think might be the other thing. Nobody would ever describe me as a people person, but my definition really is it's not about caring so much as it is about developing people. My emphasis has always been on investing in talent and developing it, not so much in the touchy-feely stuff that often gets called, people skills. There are lots of programs, of course, now that you can explore. We have a couple at CSIP. There's the SNMI program, Strategic Nonprofit Management India, that we do in collaboration with Harvard Business School. During the pandemic, we've done this other program called RISEN, Resilient Strategies for Nonprofits, which again, we do in collaboration with faculty from Harvard Business School. But the Dasra Leadership Program, there are dozens now of fellowships and incubators and accelerators that are all, I think, doing a pretty good job of helping leaders find their feet and then overcome hurdles as and when. And of course, people like you, there's now a great set of coaches out there who you can, and I think in our sector, we're reluctant to seek that kind of help. And I know from personal experience, I would really advocate for people to find the sort of coaching that they need, or coaching that they don't even know they need. I think just to have a sounding board, because quite often as a leader, it's quite a solitary role. You still have to sort of keep,
only at the top.
For your team, you still have to be brave and act like you know what you're doing. And so it really helps to have an external party who you can be vulnerable with, share your doubts, but also get a free and frank opinion, which you may or may not be able to get from your board or your team.
True, agree. So my final question to you is that what is your advice, because we have a lot of young listeners in the audience today who are to some of the, how they should manage their career. So to the rising stars of the social development sector, NGO world, NPO world, on how they should manage their careers.
Well, one of the things I say to young people at Ashoka, for example, is life expectancy in their generation is going to be over 100 years. So you have a lot of time to do this. You don't have to accomplish it all in the first year or the first 5 years. You can try different things. You don't have to, I think the way the world of work is today, you can probably have 3 careers in the space of your lifetime, and you don't have to, do this linear kind of career planning that, let's say, our parents' generation had to do. I think the key thing that I look for really is how do you balance the pragmatism versus the idealism, because you need the hard skills of pragmatism, of being able to generate a surplus at the end of the year, because without that, nothing else is possible. But then you also need to be able to really firmly hold on to values. So finding that balance between pragmatism and idealism is really critical. I used to say when I first moved that the big difference for me was this sector requires you to bring your whole self to the job. In the corporate sector, again, especially as a woman, you often felt that, or I often felt that the message was, just bring your brain to work and leave all that other messy stuff at home. Here, on the other hand, you will really only be as good as you bringing your mind, heart, body, soul to your job, because it's only in that balance between head and heart that you will make really good decisions. Decisions that are excessively head-driven will be bad. Decisions that are only heart-driven will be bad. So finding that mix, I think, is critical. I think the other two suggestions maybe. One is create your own peer network. You don't have to be limited by the people you work with. It's so easy, particularly with social networks and with social media and so on, to be able to say, I'd really like to be mentored by this person, or I would really like to get to know this other person better. So build your own peer networks, which can be much, and they can be global. They don't even have to be, limited either to your organization or your country, and be open to just where we talked at the beginning. You started by saying that the sectors the distinctions are blurring, and so successful models in the 21st century could come from anywhere. You could be, it could be coming from a business. It could be coming from, we're looking at, for example, how do you innovate financial models? I look at not just, development impact bonds and the social stock exchange and stuff like that. But if I look at Ford Foundation, for example, creating this new bond that allowed them to double the size of their grant making for COVID. I mean, literally got them an extra $1 billion. It was a financial innovation that could only come from somebody that perhaps was open to models that were outside of the development sphere. If you were stuck in that model of we can only give away 5% of our endowment, then you basically would have very little way of responding to COVID. So openness to ideas, perspectives, models, partnerships with across sectors, whether that's government or business or media, I think is the other piece of advice, if I could offer any advice.
Superb, wonderfully put. So we have now questions, and we have Sumita from Third Sector Partners who would like to ask you a question. So can we have the spotlight on her, please?
Good evening, Ingrid. How are you doing? I have a question for you today. So according to the Grant Thornton report, India ranks third in terms of the proportion of women in leadership positions. However, we still stand far below in terms of the parity, with just 39% of women in senior leadership roles in India. So my question to you is, can you suggest few structural changes in the organization which can ensure gender parity and also pave the way for women in leadership position?
So what we know works are, the one thing that is probably most effective is actually compulsory paternity leave. So oddly, I mean, it's an intervention for men that really benefits women as well. And I think it goes beyond, I mean, I think it goes beyond just, so first of all, it levels the playing field, right? If men and women are both going to take those breaks when they become parents, then in many ways it takes away one of the biggest disparities between men and women. But it also results in a redefinition of gender roles in the home and the family. It redefines, expectations and who is going to be the primary caregiver when it comes to children, or the primary manager or deliverer of services at home. So I think that's one thing that we should be considering. We've actually gone the other way in our country, which is that we keep extending maternity leave. So we're now, going from 3 months to 6 months to 9 months to 12 months, which is actually increasing or exacerbating in some ways the disparity that employers see when they hire women. And the other one is just a degree. This is just a matter of will. Companies that have done it, I mean, when I think back, for example, even in the 80s, to companies like ICICI Bank that had so many women in senior leadership positions, even when other banks literally had either nobody or one woman, one token woman. And it was simply a leadership that said this, we want this to happen. And so they went and created then everything from on-site crashes to flexible working to all of the things that made it possible for that exemplary cadre of women to rise to the top. What it got them was undying loyalty from those women. I mean, they were so grateful for the fact that their employer was this visionary, or treated them so, made life so easy for them, or made life, let's say, less difficult. It's never easy being a woman, but that they would stay with you for life, probably. So I think it's going to take a few companies just exercising the will to do this. And it doesn't have to be companies that are led by women. I mean, ICICI at the time didn't have a CEO who was a woman. It was just a man who thought that this was a strategically sound thing to do. And companies need to see this because organizations need to see this as a strategically sound thing to do. You're not doing women any favors by employing them. In fact, quite the contrary. You probably find that everything about your company, from the culture within your company to its performance on any metric that you can think of, will be improved by having more women in leadership. And then having women at the board and at the senior leadership level is critical if women at lower levels in the hierarchy are going to survive and thrive. I'm not suggesting that having a female CEO or having a female director is a guarantee that you will have a more feminist culture. A feminist man could probably deliver it just as well as or probably better than a non-feminist woman. But we just need more feminist leaders in positions of power to make these decisions, because it's just all the data is there. I mean, we have proven this 3,000 times on every continent, in every industry, that organizations that are led by women do better on every parameter, from profitability to growth to risk-taking to culture to all of it. So the only thing that is stopping us is patriarchal values among senior leaders, most of whom are men. Sorry,
in fact,
that was a bit of a diatribe, but it's a sore topic for me.
No, but in fact, countries also which are led by women during the pandemic have performed so much better than those led by men. So on every parameter, we have outperformed. But yes, so we have another question from a young lady in the Catalyst team, Vijaya. So could we have the spotlight on Vijaya, please?
Hi, good evening. Thank you so much for those wonderful insights. I'm from Catalyst, and we work with girls pursuing STEM education in India. My question would be, how do we build resilience and grit among girls, since we women face multiple challenges at every stage of our lives? So this is something for my girls that I would like to take up.
I don't know what the answer to that is. I mean, my own personal experience is that actually girls are better served in single-sex schools than they are in co-ed schools. And I'm biased, obviously. I went to a girls' school, but I did find that we on average were a lot more ambitious and a lot less constrained than girls in our peer group that went to co-ed schools. I think there may be some merit in thinking of at least at early stages, giving girls that safe space where they don't have to deal with the dynamics of the other genders. A huge role in this is the role of fathers, because in many ways, the first constraint that girls face is at home. And typically it's the father who quite often is the key to opening those shackles. If the father endorses the idea of education, careers, later marriage, later childbearing, then in many ways that gives girls the license to be all that they can be. The other thing we've seen is, we don't think about it, but stabilizing family livelihoods has a huge role in keeping girls in school, for example. So I've seen data from the Young Lives Project, which says that families that were beneficiaries of NREGA, there was lower dropout rates because they knew for sure that at least this much money was going to be available. And so when there was a financial crisis in the home, they didn't resort to the first immediate action, which is let's pull the girl out of school. And then ensuring safety. I mean, I think a huge barrier to girls we've seen the data, everything from just a clean toilet makes a difference in whether a girl stays in school or not. The distance to the school and the safety of that travel. The first time any girl in the neighborhood is attacked on her way to school, every girl in that neighborhood is going to face pressure to drop out. So, and the levels of biases. So the only subject I studied through my 17 years of formal education was math. And this is just because I love math. But even as a student of math, even with female teachers, we found ourselves, the girls in the class, often just being ignored in a way that our male counterparts were, not being ignored or were being called on to answer and so on. So there's the depth of bias at all levels is such that we really need to provide every form of support in the family, in the community, ensuring that we showcase success stories of girls who are making it in these fields, provide mentoring wherever that is possible. I mean, with STEM subjects in particular, one of the issues is that they're unfeminine. And so, you're going to be the nerd, the geek, the dork in your class, as opposed to being the pretty, the attractive, the feminine girl in your class. And so making it cool to be a geek, I think, is one of the behavioral change communication challenges of our time. So there's a lot.
In fact, yeah, interesting you said that, because the entire Catalyst program is geared towards bridging the confidence gap as well as mentoring. So clearly we are on the right path. Thank you so much for those wonderful insights. And while we would love to chat more with you, we've run out of time. And thank you once again, and really enjoyed. And thanks to all our listeners for joining us today. And thank you, Ingrid. Really appreciate your views. So thank you and namaste. Goodbye.
The opportunity. Bye-bye.
Thank you.